Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Lara. The concept of statelessness is introduced in Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, where it occupies a central place in her account of the processes she claims gave rise to Nazism and Stalinism. While such practices are located very firmly in the 20th century, there's been a resurgence of interest in both her work, the phenomenon of statelessness, and related issues. Now, the concept of statelessness has commonly been defined as a concept which describes the absence of nationality, both actual and effective. As a legal status, statelessness denotes the lack of a substantive relationship between the individual and the state. Arendt may best be remembered for her reporting on the war crimes trial about Eichmann and the controversies her book caused within Jewish circles and within Israel, where it was banned for 15 years. Rather, it was banned until 15 years ago, I should say. However, Arendt is also the author of a wide-ranging body of philosophical work, which includes studies on the human condition and action, bureaucratization, evil and the Holocaust, and most relevant to our lecture, the problem of righteousness. Arendt's writings now speak to a variety of distinct audiences and interest groups. The intellectual historian Martin Jay notes that Arendt is among a handful of thinkers whose names have been invoked both to legitimize and delegitimize both political and philosophical opinions. This includes those who turn to Arendt in the name of protecting asylum seekers and non-citizens, as well as others who see in her writings food for revisionist accounts of the creation of Israel. And no doubt this is because Arendt's conclusions form the basis for ground theory. In the context of our reading of Arendt, and in particular the works I mentioned, we note similar silo effects, similar intellectual compartmentalization. The net result of this is that the foundations of her arguments for the emergence of statelessness have not been actively explored. Neither has the problem of statelessness been examined alongside the lines of inquiry which run right the way across her work and which of our interest types are logically connected. As a result, these themes and the conclusions she reaches in, for example, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the intellectual debates they generated, have not, to my mind, informed a critical reading of the concept of righteousness in the origins of totalitarianism, even though they address a common theme and raise critical issues about the state, the problem of intentionality, the role of political organization and membership as an antidote to arbitrary arrest, exclusion, and the elimination, not only of persecuted Jews and other victims, but also of the capture and execution of the stateless Eichmann. My point is that if we are to use Arendt as a basis for examining contemporary accounts of statelessness, then we need to approach the theme she introduces with caution. I haven't mentioned the place of international law in the study of statelessness, and I'll say little on the subject. The reason for that is international law is sovereignty affirming. It doesn't recognize differences between states based on regime types, constitutional form, or historical development. While international law may exert some constitutive effects on states' preferences and can influence behavior, and in this context, the work of our colleagues in clarifying international norms is really quite helpful. But I believe it is more helpful to explore processes operating within the state. My interest is more practical. I wish to understand how the problems that arise from statelessness can be mitigated and suggest some solutions. Now, for social scientists, Arendt remains the first port of call for those interested in the problem of statelessness. This is understandable because for many years, many decades in fact, this issue was a minority interest, which was reported in some half-dozen books. The UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, has for decades had a mandate to work on statelessness alongside refugee protection, but it did little to advance an active agenda until quite recently. Now, by contrast, statelessness is a permanent area of policy which has been mainstreamed across UNHCR's operations, and as a result has attracted a growing number of NGOs, human rights activists, and academics who lend their support. with some notable exceptions from area studies experts, including some who are here this evening. The renewed interest in statelessness speaks to a particular set of issues, which, even if they are informed by the 20th century, are emblematic of emergent 21st century problems for the political state, principally for the political state. This includes the problems of the expansion and detention of prisons, the debates over the political rights of prisoners, the human rights challenges of removal, repatriation, and the readmission of non-citizens, especially in countries of origin, and the deprivation of citizenship of non-nationals. These problems will be the subject of examination in tomorrow's workshop, which is convened by my colleagues Helen Murray and Matthew Gibley. The current fascination with Arendt and the renewed interest in what I will call the politics of deprivation have certainly refocused our attention. But in so doing, they've also prompted us to take our eyes off the road. I will argue that in spite of its richness, a key limitation of Arendt's work is that it closes the door on restoratives who wish to the problem of statelessness and on the practical recovery of rights. I wish to explore three pathologies embedded in Arendt's work and which resonate with recent efforts to address the problem of statelessness. First, the explanatory power of Arendt's model of totalitarianism. Second, her reliance on law as a source of protection. And third, the effects of deprivation on individuality. I'll start with some observations before introducing our empirical findings, which were produced in collaboration with my colleagues, including Rajiv Lakshman, who is here somewhere, my close colleague and good friend, who has enabled me to operationalize my research questions and carried out the monumental task of analyzing our quantitative findings for 2 projects. And both of these projects have profoundly affected how I now think about the issue of statelessness. But for the benefit of those who have yet to spend 20 hours, and that's a conservative estimate, 20 hours reading a 500-page tome, here's a brief review of Arendt's interpretation of totalitarianism and its connection to statelessness. For Arendt, totalitarianism means the total domination of the state and the abolition of legal rights for large groups of people. Her work is primarily focused on Nazism, and she speaks of the institutionalization of concentration camps, where the rightless are murdered. But this account is balanced by an examination of Stalinism, which is again characterized by the removal of freedoms, deportations, and incarceration, this time in the Gulag. In spite of an extraordinary level of detail in which Arendt explores late 19th and early 20th century political struggles between parties, between nationalities, and between classes, it's very difficult to see this work as a piece of historiography. It's not systematic, and throughout this intellectual symphony, Arendt is editorializing the text. She's telling us why some events are significant, why others aren't. She's offering her own opinions, as much as she's pulling apart sources. She also throws in so many caveats that force her to explain how she's using political and sociological terminology. So, for example, anti-Semitism is just a modern phenomenon which is distinct from Jew hatred. Nationalism is a distinctly modernist development, and one which is anchored to territorial claims. This is a particular view of nationalism and a distinct approach to it as treated in the theory of nationalism. Nationalism is therefore more containable than the role of racism in colonialism. And interestingly, she mentions very little, in fact nothing, I should say, on the connection between racism, colonialism, and the slave trade. And then there are other distinctions. She draws from the Marxist liturgy, for example, in the difference between the bourgeois, the materialist, indifferent to politics, and the citizen. But she diverts from the Marxist track in her discussion of the masses. The masses have replaced classes in her account. These are the unorganized Europeans, they're the dregs, and they're contrasted against the unorganized mob. Organization, political organization, comes through very strongly as a normative explanation for vulnerability, and it's in fact central to Arendt's accusations of responsibility, which she develops in this book and subsequently. She blames the Jews for their demise and holds them partially responsible for their destruction. The Holocaust was not inevitable. Rather, it could have been avoided but for the union of what she describes as subterranean streams the union of anti-Semitism, racism, imperialism, and the alliance between capital and mob. In this struggle, she claims Jews could have engaged politically and militated for their rights, asserting a positive political identity as other national groups did, rather than retreating into bourgeois materialism. And in this, perhaps, we get a glimpse of her early interest in political Zionism, which was a Zionism by necessity, which she later discarded. Arendt's exploration of statelessness is chronicled in her chapter, The Decline of the Nation-State and the End of the Rights of Man, where she explains the condition of statelessness in the context of three losses: the loss of home, the loss of state protection, and the loss of a place in the world. These three deprivations in particular facilitate the unfolding tragedy of destruction and genocide. It is above all the absence of government, which is the only viable source of protection in her account, which signals their doom. The presence of statelessness leads Arendt to claim that human rights, supposedly universal, have no meaning unless they can be anchored to an effective source of protection, and as I said, for her, that is the state. How Jews and others became stateless is a much more complicated tale. European states repeatedly stripped foreign-born individuals of their citizenship. France did so in 1915, then the new Soviet and Turkish governments did so in 1918, denationalizing Russian, Armenian, and Hungarian refugees. Then in 1922, Belgium followed, before fascist Italy in 1926, Austria in 1933, and Germany in 1935. You'll note this is a contemporary map of Europe, not the map that she would have seen. Almost overnight, Nazi laws created millions of stateless people. Although many groups were affected, Arendt focuses on the Jews and their vulnerability, which she claims begins with their retreat and exclusion from emergent political structures. Anti-Semitism is just the catalyst for the development of totalitarianism, which she claims is enabled by the union of these subterranean streams. All of the practices I mentioned, anti-Semitism, racism, and imperialism, serve to weaken the state, the legal guarantor of rights, and see it supplanted by the nation, which is an exclusive community. For Arendt, these processes hold sufficient explanatory power. Ideology is not a causal tool, but simply a tool. Did Hitler really believe his own propaganda, she asks? Did Stalin rely on Lenin and Marx in his development of terror? On this she takes a simple view. Rather, the ideologies of the late 19th and early 20th century were cemented around political interests, which were institutionalized along ethno-national lines, and this was principally in Austria-Hungary. Totalitarianism is driven by instrumental concerns for total domination, not ideological pursuits. And this is what she sets out very clearly in the preface to her book. Now let me offer some of my own observations. On the model of totalitarianism, although Arendt includes some reflections on China, her focus is on Nazism and Stalinism, and as such doesn't really lend itself easily to an examination of other contexts where statelessness is prevalent. Many stateless people, of course, live in non-democratic systems, with some notable exceptions. But these are far from totalitarian, as I will later show. Others who've written on totalitarianism also question the basis for her comparison of regime types. And here I think in particular of the late comparative political scientist, Blitz, who disagrees with the design of her study and locates, in the first instance, Nazism within the same intellectual family as Mussolini's fascism, and Stalinism as derived from Bolshevik ideologies. Although he recognizes that Arendt's mass society approach helps to explain how Nazism took hold, he challenges her account of the inception of totalitarianism, which he claims is actually just based on a frustrated Marxism. But here, class conflict is replaced by racism and interethnic contest. Her discussion of the concepts of state and nation also introduces some concerns. She identifies qualified differences in her discussion between states, principally France and Germany. France in the Fourth Republic was just a collection of political parties. Germany was a state where allegiance and obedience dominated all forms of organization. But in this, as throughout her book, she treats issues of sovereignty and territoriality as fixed concepts. Moreover, she essentializes the differences between ethno-national groups, the one exception being her discussion on Jews, and the conflict established between communities, for example, between those living in Berlin, Avignon, Bordeaux, and new arrivals from Poland and Galicia. And yet, one might still argue that she essentializes these particular categories of Jew and sets up some binary distinctions in her discussion of the urbane city dwellers with whom she identified and the poor village folk. Such distinctions, which were later repeated in her account of the Eichmann trial, brought further criticism and accusations of personal racism. Related to this is her idealization of the state. Now, central to her claim about the damaging effects of exclusion, as I mentioned, is this belief in state protection. Certainly in her model, the loss of state protection logically connects events surrounding the denaturalization and expulsion, the creation of new refugees, and their connection to the end goal of Nazism. Denaturalized people and refugees are easier to round up and kill. However, the idea of the state as an effective guarantor of rights is deeply problematic, as informed by the category of de facto stateless person. This is a term which we regularly use. Moreover, as Kelly Staples writes in her excellent book, Retheorizing Statelessness, citizenship in weak states, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, can hardly be considered rights protecting, while in oppressive states like Myanmar, Burma, where the Rohingya have been brutally deprived of nationality and they're the victims of atrocious crimes which are carrying on right now, the allure of citizenship is meaningless. In addition to the stateless Rohingya, virtually all other non-Buddhist groups in Burma have been exposed to violence from internal security forces. Such protection, state protection, is a fiction. In both states, the ideas of citizenship, protection, and legitimacy must therefore be seriously questioned. In this context, it's also interesting to note some contemporary ironies which I would say further challenge her belief in state protection. We note that just as quickly as citizenship may be removed, it may also be granted. And here, one only has to look at Russia's distribution of citizenship within Abkhazia, which was a clear attempt to undermine Georgian sovereignty. We might also note, more spectacularly, how stateless Kurds in Syria, after decades of exclusion, were finally granted citizenship by the desperate Assad regime as it restocked its arsenal and took aim on rebels. This was a new and stunning development, but one may also question just how meaningful it is. Similarly, Arendt's belief in political organization as an antidote to liberal threats is confusing. Organization in and of itself is not ennobling. Several of the groups in Arendt's world did organize, they did mobilize, but they also participated in the slaughter, often against each other. And we note that there were other genocides that took place in parallel as a result of realpolitik and territorial conquest, neither of which are really captured in the model. So Arendt's belief in political mobilization as a means of salvation, to me, doesn't really address some of the underlying issues with respect to, for example, the centrality of habitus, the idea that values, expectations, and dispositions that people bring with them as they enter political contest. In her model, she presupposes that the various nationalities that militated did so on a level field, and this simply wasn't the case. It certainly doesn't explain how some groups were victims of genocide while others weren't. Others present have written much more about theories of membership as a basis for protection. All I will add on this is that there's still a pronounced debate between liberal nationalists, communitarians, and constructivists over the degree to which locality determines how rights may be accessed and guarded. Also the degree to which the state may, without reservation, strip people of their citizenship. Again, this is a topic that we'll be examining tomorrow. I'd simply like to record that while murder, torture, and expulsion are common practices in Burma as in Syria, states are more constrained in their use of political violence, and they're more likely to be called to account today than not necessarily stopped. The international system, which Arendt debunks, is without question terribly flawed, but it's not completely useless. So the reality is that we can take away chemical weapons and perhaps slow down the killing, even if there's insufficient will to stop it altogether. While such conclusions may be of little practical value to the victims in Syria or Burma, for political scientists they're nonetheless important. They're important because they help to inform our understanding about the limitations and mechanisms of protection, and we would hope perhaps influence how we act in the future. My last observation before I turn to our empirical work is on the theme of individuality. Arendt speaks of the state as having been reduced to bare nature and describes a desperate people existing outside of the law. Without question, this macro picture that she presents is accurate. But that seems to be where her analysis stops. I wish to pick just a few holes here, and to this end I'm going to turn to some of the writings by Primo Levi. Now, like Arendt, Levi was stripped of his rights under the racial laws, the context for him being Italy as opposed to Germany. He was deported to a camp, as was she. However, he was deported to Auschwitz, where he spent 11 months. And shortly after his liberation, he began reporting his experiences of life in the camps. His account is profoundly important because in it we see his discussion of individuality. He identifies how it was retained and recovered even in the most difficult of situations. We see this in particular in his memoir, If This Is a Man, and in his subsequent writings, The Drowned and the Saved. We know that Levi, who asked the question, if this is a man, answered in the affirmative, and his writings identify ways in which inmates resisted, how, as he describes it, how they demonstrated the power to refuse our own consent. Levi distinguishes between what he calls, and this is a loaded term, the musulmana, which is a term used to describe those suffering from hunger and exhaustion, who have consigned themselves to death and are prepared to sink. Hence, these are the people who will become the drowned, and the adaptable, the strong, and the astute. In Levi's account, it is, this doesn't work. It is the musulmana who are the backbone of the camp, and their experience and death contrast with the path to salvation, which he says are improbable and many. He says, many were the ways devised and put into effect by us in order not to die, as many as there are with different human characters. But this is not a return to nature, as Arendt might see. Not only do these people have numbers, quite literally tattoos, they also have names. And he writes, we do not believe in the most obvious and facile deduction that man is fundamentally brutal, egoistic, and stupid once every civilized institution is taken away. We believe, rather, that the only conclusion to be drawn is that in the face of driving necessity and physical disabilities, many social habits and instincts are reduced to silence. These opinions have been echoed in other survivors' accounts and have been reaffirmed in a new book, which just came out last year by the German sociologist Maya Söderberg, which argues that in spite of everything, prisoners were still capable of acting and exerting a degree of control over aspects of their lives, for example, over language. And such control was grounded precisely in their habitus. I'll explore this question of adaptive responses, together with the role of agency, and offer some suggestions as to how this most basic deprivation may be confronted. Before doing so, let me share with you some vignettes as to how I came across the problem of statelessness and how my research developed. There were certainly some background melodies and, I should say, background radiation, which exposed me to this topic and the critical issues which Arendt raises regarding the effects of displacement. And throughout both my undergraduate and postgraduate studies, I was drawn to visit both the intellectual and the physical terrain, that is, Europe and Russia, and that is the subject of the book. In 2004, however, I returned to Croatia to interview returnees and displaced people. And as a result of my previous research, I had pretty much discarded this idea that return promotes justice or enables the post-conflict state to recover the skills and training required by refugees during their sojourn abroad. Rather, I wanted to explore the problems that prevented people from reintegrating in post-war society. And it was in particular one interview with an older couple, an older Serb couple, in fact, Rado and Mila, which focused my mind. The two had been displaced during the tail end of the massive population shifts, which saw, first of all, the principally ethnic Croat community displaced, and then, in a retaliatory push, the Serb communities victimized. And in the case of these two, it was following the government's liberation of Western Slavonia. That's more or less this area, this oval area in the center of the picture. They were living in a one-room wooden barrack, which was adorned just with some hanging plant containers, which had been carved out of plastic Coke bottles. And they told me about the problems they experienced in recovering their citizenship, and why, after almost 10 years of displacement, they were still homeless and dependent on the UNHCR, and were shortly going to be handed over to the care of the Croatian Red Cross. I hadn't really considered the difficulty of recovering documentation as a means of asserting and proving one's identity until this visit. Now, upon my return, my wife presented me with an article which she found in the Financial Times, which reported on the upcoming referendum in Slovenia, Croatia's neighbor. And the subject of this referendum was the situation of the erased, the non-ethnic Slovenes, some 25,000 people, who did not take up Slovenian citizenship initially when it was offered, and as a result, they saw their residency rights revoked. And this was done through the Ministry of the Interior. It was a formal process which cascaded right the way down to town halls across the country. And this prompted my next research, where with the assistance of a retired judge and several individuals at the Peace Institute and the University of Ljubljana, I returned to the area. I went to Slovenia with Haley, and we carried out about 40 interviews where we heard how people saw their documents destroyed in front of them, how they were rendered aliens, and denied opportunities to work, access healthcare, and were socially distanced from neighbors and family members. And one parent told us how, when his daughters turned 18, they were put on buses and taken to the border with Croatia, destination Bosnia, even though they had no actual connection to the country. Now, while the erasure was consolidated, Slovenia emerged as a post-socialist success story. This is what one heard regularly. And it entered into negotiations with the European Union, acceding in 2004. It was this experience which really spoke to me as a comparativist and led to the studies which I'll now present. Contemporary statelessness is more varied and certainly more nuanced than what Arendt describes. Today, people may become stateless by being denied and deprived of citizenship, often as punishment for supporting the losing side in the War of Independence, seeing their citizenship withdrawn, having been identified as a fifth column, losing it during the process of state succession. This is Sudan. As we know, there is now the independent state of South Sudan. Or as a result of gender-based discrimination, where women are not allowed to pass on their nationality to their children, as a result of a conflict of laws between states, or by not having had their births registered as a result of administrative and other barriers which prevent people from obtaining documents. We don't know the numbers of stateless people around the world. The UNHCR estimates there are some 12 million, with 600,000 in Europe, mostly in the Baltic states. This number has been used for many years now, so I truly question its value. but nonetheless, that is the official figure. Here's some groups of formerly stateless people. These are the Nubians in Kenya. They arrived with the British Army over 100 years ago, but were never considered among the 42 recognized national groups. As a result, they've been denied documentation and associated political rights, and many of them are confined to the slums of Kibera on the edge of Nairobi. These are the estate Tamils in Sri Lanka. They arrived from Tamil Nadu again over a century ago as plantation workers. They were denied nationality and documentation and confined to plantations, principally tea and to some extent rubber and coffee plantations until 2003. And then we have the Rohingya of Burma and Bangladesh. Their citizenship was withdrawn in Burma, which doesn't recognize them as one of the national groups. They've been denied a host of rights. Most significant is the right to marry. And as a result, this has forced tens of thousands of people over the border to Bangladesh, where they are effectively refugees, but they've had to live in unregistered refugee camps, their refugee status not having been confirmed. There they've been subject to exploitation and police brutality. Here's a photograph of some bonded laborers. The conditions in Bangladesh have also sparked mass migrations, with boats setting off across the Andaman Sea. In some cases, these boats have been intercepted by Thai vessels, only to be pushed back into deeper waters. And so the situation of the Rohingya is particularly bad. This is a situation of people in a truly appalling neighborhood, and I dare say Arendt would immediately identify with these people who are at great risk, especially now when massacres are happening. These are the Crimean Tatars. This is a group of formerly deported people who were relocated en masse by Stalin to Uzbekistan and Central Asia. And then we have two states where there are horrific racial abuses taking place. First, we have Cote d'Ivoire, where ethnic purity laws are in effect. And the purpose is to look at the descendants of West African migrants, migrants from neighboring states, who are identified as non-evil heat and have been denied citizenship. And then finally, in the Dominican Republic, the descendants of Haitians have been denied the right to register births for decades. They've been subject to both individual and group expulsions. I've been told that border guards use a brown paper test, which is held up, and if you are lighter than the brown paper bag, then you are of Hispanic descent and you can stay, and if you are darker than the brown paper bag, then you must go. In September, this long-running discrimination against Dominicans of Haitian descent took a turn for the worse when the Constitutional Court ruled that anyone born since 1929 to foreign parents who couldn't prove their regular migration status has been wrongly registered as Dominican. And as a result, it looks like some 250,000 people are liable to lose their Dominican nationality and become stateless and vulnerable to further expulsions. This decision, understandably, has received widespread international condemnation. And in response, the government has prepared some special legislation, which it's going to present in some 2 weeks. The expectation, however, is that this legislation will include various discriminatory requirements, such as strict linguistic criteria, competence, for example, in both written and spoken Spanish. So this isn't really the place for optimism. Arendt's belief in the state's ability to guarantee rights formed the backdrop to the first study I'll present. I've already noted that there are fundamental issues with this state-centric logic, but more influential was the fact that UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, had been heralding reform in a number of countries, and no one had bothered to put this to the test. I wanted to evaluate the remedial power of the claim of the remedial power of the state and to explore the UNHCR's assertions of reform. And above all, to see whether or not it's believed that corrective nationality laws addresses the problem of statelessness. My close colleague Maureen Lynch and I assembled a team with partners in Estonia, Slovenia, Ukraine, Mauritania, the Gulf, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, and designed an interview-based project. Our sample size for this project was small. We had only 120 participants. And the interviews at this point were purely indicative. But our aim was to investigate the benefits of citizenship and the degree to which the granting of citizenship has enabled citizens to access their rights. We wanted to know what were the barriers preventing people who've been granted citizenship from the full enjoyment of their rights. There are too many case studies really to mention, but I will just draw upon two in particular to illustrate our findings. In Kenya, where citizenship is defined with reference to the departed colonial order prior to 1963, the Constitution requires that Kenyan citizenship should be accessible to citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies or British protected persons. British protected persons as defined under the 1948 British Nationality Act. But there's been confusion as to whether or not Africans could be deemed citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies. And indeed, the term British protected persons is ambiguous. The route to citizenship is bifurcated. There are, in fact, two routes. The first is birth associated with ethnic origin, the idea of jus sanguinis, and birth on territory, jus soli. These two are combined in the Kenyan constitution. But in addition, there's a demand that, in addition to being citizens of the United Kingdom, of colonies, or a British protected person, a person must also have been born in Kenya as of the date, 12th of December 1963, by a parent who was also born in Kenya. So in practice, it was assumed that indigenous African communities satisfied these requirements, but the rest of the population, including the Nubians, the image I just showed you, had to provide documentary evidence to satisfy this demand. And as a result, a practice emerged by which membership in a group indigenous to Kenya became the de facto determinant for complying with the citizenship requirements of the Constitution. This therefore shifted the burden of proof onto the applicant, who needed to provide supporting evidence of their parents' birth. There was also a pattern of gender discrimination as well, I should add. Now, a few years before our study, there was a draft constitution which was put into effect, which de-emphasized some of these concerns. And this constitution resulted from a successful legal challenge which was brought by the Nubian elders on the basis that its members had been denied identity cards and passports and had been historically marginalized. In addition to this, the combined effects of demographic changes and housing pressures in Kagera, and during the 2007 presidential elections, it was clear that there was an emphasis to try to capture this potential political constituency. And as a result, a promise was made to accelerate the distribution and production of identity cards. We began our study 2 years after this process. And at that point, tens of thousands of Nubians were still without citizenship. We found that hospital authorities refused to register the births of Nubian children. There was still a massive documentary challenge to meeting the requirements to prove citizenship. There were also inordinate delays. Moreover, citizenship had not improved access to housing, sanitation, or water, or education for the participants we interviewed. In Sri Lanka, reform was signaled by the change of the nationality law in 2003. The estate towns we interviewed were the descendants of those who had been brought to Sri Lanka some 150 years earlier, and the largest concentrations were in the center of the country. Their status within Sri Lanka was ambiguous. The Citizenship Act of Sri Lanka conferred citizenship on all those who were born in Sri Lanka and whose father was born in Sri Lanka. There was a separate act for those of Indian and Pakistani descent, another Citizenship Act, which provided citizenship by restoration, so again, by registration, so again, a bifurcated approach. However, application for citizenship was considerably simpler than what we saw in Kenya. The plight of ethnic Tamils had been taken up on several occasions between India and Sri Lanka, mostly in the 1970s. But nonetheless, there were hundreds of thousands of people who hadn't been covered by these developments. The 2003 Act was again trumpeted by the UNHCR, the representative in Colombo declaring that almost overnight the stateless population was more than halved. It was a huge success story in the global effort to reduce statelessness. Our investigation provided some contradictory results. Of the estimated 900,000 Tamils, estate Tamils, most still encountered practical problems as a result of state administration. The state officials were not fully aware of the legal requirements that followed the 2003 law. And so in practice, although the government granted the right to citizenship to people of Indian origin, many of those interviewed were still unable to obtain documents, and there was widespread ignorance about the value of citizenship. Our findings identified a number of benefits that followed from the reforms of nationality laws, but they also identified a number of discrepancies. So in the first instance, we found that citizenship improved labor market access. It also improved access to property ownership, but it didn't remove substantial inequalities. Moreover, the benefits of citizenship were not evenly distributed. There were clearly some that gained much more than others. There were also notable cleavages within the populations, and fragmentation and division occurred both before and after the granting of citizenship. Further systemic problems of poverty and corruption undermined the potential benefits of citizenship throughout all the countries that we studied. Our conclusion from this was that documentation of all sorts, not just birth registration, is essential to the realization of human rights. That demographics matter. As we saw in Kenya, where there was a large number of stateless people relative to the overall population, there was a clear political interest in regularizing their status. And indeed, this relates to the point I mentioned with respect to Syria and the Kurds. Recognition and exoneration were deeply important for the successful integration of formerly stateless people. We also found that populations with a recognized ethno-national identity were easily integrated. Those who had a shared understanding of their relationship to the state concerned. And that appeared to determine the degree and manner to which they were integrated post-statelessness. But we noted that the ending of direct discrimination on the basis of nationality did not undo the structural effects or other modes of discrimination which are interwoven. And these findings led directly to our second study. With funding from the US State Department, we put together a smaller team. We focused on just 4 countries, Bangladesh, Kenya, Slovenia, and Sri Lanka. And with Rajiv's assistance, we put together a quantitative survey, a survey which was rolled out to 970 households. We also carried out 60 key informant interviews. We used a control group of those who were born as citizens, and this was used to contrast with the experiences of those who had fairly recently acquired citizenship. In order to do so, in order to examine the impact of deprivation of citizenship, we adapted the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework. Now, this is a model which has been around and used by people in the development community for some 12, 15 years now. It was first popularized by DFID to explore how livelihood strategies and choices informed developmental outcomes. In this model, vulnerability is contextualized by shocks. So in this context, we're talking about the shock of losing one's citizenship. And at the center is a pentagon of assets. Now, these are defined in terms of 5 types of capital. Here I should say, contemporary economics has moved considerably over the last 20 years, and so classical notions which only recognize capital and labor as the main factors of production have been moved aside. They're far more ecumenical about how we talk about capital. Central to this is the idea of human capital, which is measured in terms of people's health and knowledge and skills, all of which are needed for productive work. So, coming to university might be seen as an investment in one's human capital. Natural capital, which includes the resources which can be converted into stock or energy, or materials that can be produced into goods and services. Financial capital, so for example, the money in our pocket, or stocks and bonds, or shares and bonds. This financial capital enables other types of capital to be traded. And we have physical capital, or manufactured capital, which includes the factories, machines, and tools which enable the production process. And finally, social capital, which is defined in terms of the institutions that help us maintain and develop these forms of capital. So here we think of institutions that allow us to engage in partnerships with others, so families, communities, business organizations, schools. Now, this framework allows us to examine the effects of the loss of citizenship on the 5 types of capital, and to see how they're affected by the livelihood strategies that result in the choices that are made, and ultimately how this influences development outcomes and feeds back into policy. We used a range of subjective and objective criteria for the purposes of designing our questionnaire. We used various proxies, so for example, for income, we used the proxy of expenditure. We asked about spending on rent, lodging and food, transportation and education. We asked participants to rank their health against a 5-part scale, from extremely sick to very healthy, and very healthy was measured in terms of those who had spent less than 5 days on sick leave a year. And the rights that we looked at included exercising one's culture and religious practices. We looked at physical security, the exercise of communal rights, associations, groups, and the like. We explored access to services, including hospitals, and the availability of safe drinking water, access to public transportation, primary and secondary schools. We asked about access to police, courts, and legal assistance. For financial capital, we asked about housing, shelter, and the availability of toilets, vehicles, jewelry. And natural capital was examined in terms of both land and livestock. Financial capital, we also asked, as I said, about cash and savings, both formal and informal levels. We used multivariate regression analysis to examine the survey data, and qualitative research methods to interpret our interview findings. The survey and interview data brought up a lot of information about the local context, and we found that in some cases, the gap between citizens and non-citizens appeared to be narrowing. This prompted some very important questions about the role of social institutions. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, where we did find it was narrowing, we noted that labor unions were particularly influential. In addition to much information about the local context, we were also able to identify some generalizable conclusions about the long-term effects of the deprivation of statelessness. And this became the signature note, if you like, to this study. We found that statelessness decreased income by some 33%. It decreased the likelihood of owning property by almost 60%. And it also had a major negative impact on human capital acquisition. So in some cases we found that there were people who had enjoyed 6 years less education than full citizens. We also found some notable gender considerations. We found that larger families had more social capital, and that this increased dramatically with each additional member. But in female-headed households, the presence of formerly stateless women decreased social capital. But with the addition of each additional female member, that increased the prospect of greater financial capital. So this led us to conclude that women appeared to be better strategizers in this struggle against poverty and exclusion. Now, taken together, these two studies are most telling about the nature of statelessness, and they open up a number of avenues for consideration. In the context of Arendt, we note that the antecedents of statelessness are more varied. Statelessness is the product of deliberate, accidental, and circumstantial events. It doesn't necessarily entail the loss of rights in totalizing systems. Rather, we find, as with the Nubians or the Bihari in Bangladesh, there are many groups that have had considerable access to courts, and there has been a notable degree of contestation which runs counter to the negative account given by her. The stateless people that we interviewed were not necessarily the pitiless and unconnected individuals. Further, we were able to distinguish between cases on the basis to which stateless people enjoyed access to rights, and this doesn't necessarily cut across the totalitarian model either. So rather, we were able to group together the democratic state of Slovenia with the non-democratic, until very recently, if one believes it, state of Myanmar. And we were able to contrast this with states such as Sri Lanka and Ukraine, so again, opening up this question of regime types. Related to the above findings is the ambiguous role of the state as a guarantor of rights. Citizenship in several cases did not ameliorate the conditions of the formerly stateless, and as I've argued, in many states it's questionable just how valuable citizenship is in terms of practical protection. Statelessness is a structural problem that came out very clearly from our research. It stems from the deprivation of nationality. The quantitative evidence presented shows that it has an enduring effect over time. Now, these conclusions have important ramifications for the design of humanitarian policy. As I've argued, nationality reform in and of itself doesn't provide much relief to the excluded. Rather, we should recognize the complexity that is statelessness and the challenges posed, especially in developing country contexts. Our research points to the imperative of rights-based approaches to development. If we accept that statelessness is a structural problem, then we need to identify ways of correcting the inequalities which continue to disempower and exclude. That also means including nationality criteria in development planning alongside other key indicators. Our research suggests that strengthening human capital, above all improving investment in health and education, can help to narrow the gap. But just as we have pro-poor interventions which focus on specific categories of people, for example, women, veterans, or those living in river basin conditions, we too should press for the inclusion of stateless people as a distinct category of beneficiary. I've put forward a few recommendations which follow from our research. And in this context, I should say something about the ever-pressing necessity of impact. This is #trends. As social scientists, we are increasingly required to justify how we use public funds. We need to demonstrate the benefits of our research in terms of the change that it produces. This model has more than a couple of problems. It assumes, first of all, that policymakers have a genuine interest in research. It ignores the political context in which policy is made and the sites of contestation within the policy context. The British government knows about the political exclusion of the Rohingya. It knows about the scale of the crimes being committed there. It's simultaneously receiving warnings, courting mealy-mouthed reformers, and providing military training to the Burmese junta, which has been central to the mistreatment of Burma, but is still seen as the gateholder to this country, which has enormous natural wealth. How ideas latch on to interests and shift minds is a complex matter, and one which deserves further recognition. On the theme of persuasion, I've mentioned habitus briefly. Again, there's very little reception given to the barriers which undermine opportunities to make one's case. This is not an excuse. I just want to point out the notion of positionality. Where we are placed affects the way we are valued and the uptake of our research. This is also a structural problem. But it's not necessarily the most helpful way of identifying the uses of one's research. I'd say that positionality is a can of worms which we need to pull apart, not least because the question of value, as you see, is subjective. And there are snobs and cliques and clubs and traditions of nepotism and favoritism, which, for the sake of academic discourse, we would just call social roles and social institutions. But their interest is not always to support quality research, and politics is ever present. Now, that said, we have some important claims to impact. The former Assistant Secretary of State cited from our report and shared it with her boss, who before her left actively promoted reform at the UN level. And our research became a footnote in US humanitarian policy, as well as in a Supreme Court case, where it played a part in the final, unfortunately negative decision. Arendt was in many respects an intellectual maverick to whom we owe considerable debt for her analysis, and certainly for introducing the problem of statelessness. But her work warrants a critical reading. As I've said, statelessness is both more varied and more nuanced than we find in her writings. Arendt argues from the extremes, and for that reason I've tried to meet her there. Throughout this lecture, I have drawn attention to the notions of power and the potential for contestation within systems and within states. I've argued that not only is Arendt's model of totalitarianism less applicable today, but her reliance on law as a source of protection runs counter to contemporary realities. I've also argued that the absence of individuality in her discussion is challenged by personal counts, not only from the 1930s, but from today. The participants in our study enjoyed varying degrees of agency. And they too had names, and they were aware of their standing in the discriminatory order in which they lived. By focusing our analysis within the state and analyzing the context in which stateless people live, we've been able to identify interests, political cleavages, and arenas for engagement. I've appealed to development agencies and donor governments to consider the stateless as a specific category of beneficiary in order to remedy the effects of discrimination and dispowerment. Throughout my lecture, my analysis has been premised on the belief that the role of the political scientist is not simply to clarify how we understand the state, but equally to provide solutions. I have tried to do both. You've been most indulgent. Thank you.